Well, hey guys, Gaji here. As we start to look at, as we've been looking at kind of the politics and some of the ideas of the 1960s, we're going to look at Lyndon Johnson, takes over the presidency after John F. Kennedy, and talk about his domestic policies a little bit. So, what he's trying to do. We talk about domestic policies. These are the policies that affect people that live in the country, as opposed to foreign policy, which we'll be getting into later in the war in Vietnam. And so that's really what I'm going to focus on today here is Johnson, LBJ, as he's often referred to, in his Great Society. And talk a little bit about Johnson himself as we go forward here. So the idea here is at this point you should have read, we had the assignment where you've read through talking about John F. Kennedy and his New Frontier and some of his Cold War policies. And where we ended up in the reading is, well, his assassination. And so, as you read, and as you may know, certainly November 22nd, 1963, JFK is tragically shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. Go check out the conspiracy theories about that. Mostly it seems like, it was the single shooter that killed him. And really just a tragedy that affected so deeply so many Americans, as you can imagine. The president assassinated, and in Dallas, Texas, is where this happened. And guys, I'm too young for this, but if you ask your grandparents, because certainly my parents, they would know exactly where they were when they heard that Kennedy was shot. And so Kennedy is shot and he's killed, and well, we have Lyndon Johnson comes forward to be the next president of the United States. And this is a very famous picture of him on Air Force One as they're traveling back from Dallas, Texas to Washington, D.C. On his left, so on the right, that's Jackie Kennedy, the First Lady, JFK's wife. Imagine how hard this moment was for her. She's trying to, show support. Her husband was killed. She's right next to him just hours before this. This is the new First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson. And there's the person we want to talk about today, Lyndon Johnson, as he now takes over the presidency in such unbelievably tragic circumstances. So just a little bit about Lyndon Johnson. He's born in Texas, rural Texas, born poor. I just kind of like to mention that because I think sometimes we get this impression with presidents and even politicians generally that they all come from these rich families, and, which is really not the case. I mean, many of them are, but a lot of our presidents certainly not. And Lyndon Johnson's definitely an example of not. He grows up poor in rural Texas. He has, and I'm not going to go through his whole biography, but he has extensive experience in Congress, a couple decades worth, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And in 1952, he becomes the Senate Majority Leader. So that is he's a Democrat. So he's the top Democrat in the Senate. The Democrats control the Senate. So he is one of the three key figures in our political system. So you think about the president, and when you think about Congress, you think about the Majority Leader in the Senate, and then in the House, think about the Speaker of the House. I mean, he is a big, important figure in our politics throughout the 50s. Now, you might be wondering yourself, maybe, why are we talking about this? Why is this particularly important other than just having information about LBJ? And the idea here is that Johnson is kind of an exception when we look at our presidents. So when we think about presidents, sometimes we talk about, the president passes this law and does that and passes that. Actually, remember, they don't really pass them. It's Congress that does that. So presidents have to get Congress to pass the things they want to pass. And what's interesting is that our presidents in recent history really do not have a lot of experience in Congress, whose job it is to pass laws. So that skill is something that Johnson definitely has, and we generally don't see that in presidents. Interestingly, our current president, Joe Biden, he does. He has a ton of legislative experience, even more than Johnson did. But you go through recent presidents, they really don't. Trump, none. Obama, very little. George W. Bush, none. Clinton, none. George Bush Sr., none. Reagan, none. Carter, none. You get the idea. And as we talk about the ability to get stuff done, this stuff is going to happen, spoiler alert, we just need to keep that in mind. All right, so 1960, obviously you guys read about, JFK wins the nomination, so the Democrats choose Kennedy to run for president against Nixon, ultimately wins. Now Johnson, he wanted to be president, and he ran against JFK to try to be the Democratic nominee, and he loses. But Kennedy and the Democrats decide that Lyndon Johnson will be his running mate. He'll run the candidate for vice president in order to balance the ticket. And I'm sure many of you see that, you wonder, well, what does that mean to balance the ticket? Well, typically with vice presidents is they're important in the election to sort of say, okay, if you have a president with these kind of characteristics, maybe we should balance them out with a vice president. So for example, usually we think about geography throughout most of our history. JFK, Massachusetts. Johnson from Texas. You have a northern candidate, southern candidate. And for a big chunk of our history, that was really what we meant by balancing the ticket. But more recently, the geography these days is less important. But you can also see some other balancing, right? You can see JFK as being younger, a bit more inexperienced. Johnson, very experienced. He wasn't that much older than JFK, but a lot more experienced, especially in the legislature. It is really important that, Johnson is from the South because you have to get support of the Southern Democrats. And so Johnson becomes vice president. Now, to remember, guys, for the most part, vice presidents actually don't do anything. It's a pretty powerless position. So you just kind of wait around until you become president, which is, what happens. So in many ways, Johnson is we can call it an accidental president, although he will, as we'll see, win his own election. But here they are at the Democratic National Convention in 1960. So it's worth taking a minute to thinking about Johnson and his very unique and infamous or famous leadership style. So as a member of Congress, he had developed this, style, this ability, this skill, as part of his personality to persuade people to get the stuff done that he wants, which any leader would have. And Johnson, he was an interesting guy. He's physically a big man. He was 6'4". I don't know exactly how much he weighed, but he had to have been over 200 pounds. He's not like a skinny 6'4". He's a big guy, and he was loud and aggressive, and he cursed all the time, and he smoked all the time, cigarettes, and just this ball of energy and forcefulness and charisma. And while he was especially as Senate Majority Leader and later as president, historians would later even kind of create a term for how he would try to get people to do what he wanted. They called it the Johnson treatment, or the treatment. And it kind of looked like this. There's some great pictures I want to show you here. Hopefully you'll notice what's going on here. Where he would use his frame, because he's 6'4", he's going to be taller than most people, gets uncomfortably close to you, peering over you just to get you to do what you wanted. And that's what, and he's the president of the United States too, so he's got the force of that office. And remember, the people that he's talking to here, these are all members of Congress, senators, members of his cabinet. This is a very famous picture. It's like, are they really happy? See that lead? You can almost see it as bullying, but it wasn't just simply that. He also used his charisma, but this is, well, when we start to think later about how he gets stuff done, I don't want to say it's just because of this, but this is a big part of it. So, you can see another one there, I like that shot. I just want to, give me a second. I'm going to read from you from a book a historian wrote about Johnson, talking about the treatment. And he wrote, The treatment could last 10 minutes or 4 hours. It came enveloping its target at the Johnson Ranch swimming pool, in one of Johnson's offices, in the Senate cloakroom, on the floor of the Senate itself, or in the White House, wherever Johnson might find a fellow senator within his reach. This was written before he was president. Its tone could be supplication, accusation, cajolery, exuberance, scorn, tears, complaint, and a hint of a threat, meaning he'd use all sorts of different emotions to try to get you to do something. It was all these together. It ran the gamut of human emotions. Its velocity was breathtaking, and it was all in one direction. Interjections from the target were rare, meaning you didn't interrupt him. Johnson anticipated them before they could be spoken. He moved in close, his face a scant millimeter from its target, his eyes widening and narrowing, his eyebrows rising and falling. From his pockets poured clippings, memos, statistics. Mimicry, humor, the genius of analogy made the treatment an almost hypnotic experience and rendered the target stunned and helpless. I love that description. This is a big part of how we did. So you remember in politics, it's about the force of your ideas and persuading people, but it is about your personal charisma, especially when you think about these people at these high levels of government. These are incredibly charismatic, ambitious people. And I love this picture because you can tell here, if you can see really closely, he's actually got this 90-year-old senator from Rhode Island kind of pinned against a table in a room, trying to get him to pass civil rights legislation. So the thing to finish up here real quick, just to give you a kind of a flavor of what Johnson was like. He was incredibly ambitious, and that's not unusual. If you're president of the United States, you're going to be ambitious. But he really, really thought he could be just the greatest president there was. And again, I always imagine that's kind of true for most presidents, but it really kind of drove him. He was egocentric in that way. He saw himself as an outsider from poor Texas, even though he'd been in the Senate or House for decades. But he really did want to help people. And people are going to disagree with how he tried to do it, but to understand that and in that force of nature, to try to do that and just work so hard to do that. And again, I don't want to paint Johnson as completely separate from other presidents, because I think there's a certain bit of truth to all presidents here. But when we think about all the stuff that Johnson gets passed while he's president, you get an idea of how he's able to do it. And so, one last example, he is a crass guy, and he would swear every other word. But a great thing that I read once is, so he might be talking in a room, and he's trying to pass, talk about different education policy or poverty policy or whatever, and maybe he's drinking some coffee. I actually don't know what he drank. And he's got to go to the bathroom. He just doesn't go to the bathroom by himself. He would say, "Hey, you guys, grab your stuff, walk with me," and then he'd go to the bathroom. And they'd be in the bathroom with him, and he'd be still talking while he's going to the bathroom. That's the kind of guy he was. And so that style is going to lead to some real action. And so I'm going to stop right here as we talked about his style, and we'll start talking about some of the accomplishments, at least domestic policy accomplishments, of Lyndon Johnson. So I'll be back to talk about that. Thank you.